Hi! This week we're going to start the section on culture. It is a broad topic, so we're going to divide it up into a few smaller PowerPoints. And I want to start off by asking the question, what is culture? I know this seems like a simple question. It's a word that we're all familiar with, that we've used for a very long time. But I like to start each new section off with a working definition. So while there are several definitions that can be used for culture, one that we're going to use is a group of belief systems, norms, and values practiced by a people. So it really does encompass all of those things or cultural traits that involve what we believe, what is considered a social norm, what we value, and often it comes up whether or not these traits are learned or genetic. While some may be able to make the case that there are some aspects of culture that are genetic, usually when that gets explored a little further, it tends to be referring more to what it means to be human rather than to a particular culture. When we're talking about culture in this context, when we're referring to customs and beliefs and language and foods and clothing, those sorts of things tend to be learned, meaning they are created or they are constructions of the society that we live in. Typically, you don't come out of the womb speaking a particular language. You have to learn it over time. So as I said, while there could be a genetic component possibly to some aspects, generally with culture, we're talking more about a learned behavior. Now, culture is such a broad topic, and because of that, we're going to be dividing it up into various subtopics. So it's a little more easily organized and structured in your notes. And the two broadest categories of culture are material culture and non-material culture. So first, if we look at material culture basically involves all of those things that we can touch. So they are tangible. It's not ideas, it's not beliefs, but it's things that we can see, that we can feel. So things like art, houses, clothing, foods, these are all part of material culture. Now, in some cases, when we talk about material culture, you might think of very grand things, like in the picture. You might be thinking about ruins or temples, which are part of material culture, but it could also be ordinary things. For example, one time when I was a student, I was taking a class just in material culture, and one of the assignments was to bring a spoon to class, just a simple spoon. And I thought this was silly at the time, but I did the assignment and I brought in the spoon that I used for breakfast that morning. And when I got to class, I realized that everyone was actually using a different type of spoon to fulfill that assignment. So I brought in what I used for breakfast. So it was a utilitarian object. The person next to me brought in a silver spoon that was in a chest that their parents had in the dining room. So that's an aspect of culture. Why do we have this silverware that we're probably never going to use, or maybe just use for special occasions? Or maybe we're going to use it as an heirloom piece. Someone else brought in a little souvenir spoon. That was a collector's item that was picked up at a tourist attraction. Some of you may have seen these. They're usually a few inches long. You certainly can't eat with them. And they have, something on the end that is, a token of where you were. So it was a souvenir. That's a completely different aspect of culture. Someone else brought in a wooden spoon that had been passed down through the family that was used to create certain dishes. So it seemed like it had some kind of magical powers. It put the love in the tomato sauce, for example. And it was a cherished item. It had sentimental value, but it was still a spoon. And then someone took a spoon that was off the wall that was used as decoration. from the grandparents' house. So it was a giant fork and spoon, and they took the spoon. So just something as simple as a spoon ranged from a utensil to an heirloom to a souvenir, an important component of a recipe to a household decoration. So while grand things are part of material culture, even just the ordinary things are also part of material culture as well. So what they have in common is that you can see them, we can touch them, we essentially made them. At the other end of the spectrum, we have non-material culture. And these are all the aspects of culture that we can't touch or feel. So these are our belief systems. What do we believe in? What do we not believe in? Our practices, our customs, our traditions, our aesthetics. What do we consider pleasing to the eye? What do we consider beautiful? And our value system. Again, just like material culture, these are things that are going to vary greatly between cultures, just like art and houses and clothing and foods vary greatly from one culture to another culture. Our belief systems, our customs, our traditions, the holidays that we celebrate, what we consider beautiful, what we hold dear to our hearts, all of these things are just as important in material culture, but they are more abstract. They're things that we can't necessarily see or touch, but it's a very important component of culture. Now, there's also ways in which we can organize culture. Now, these three things here, mentefacts, sociofacts, and artifacts, are not necessarily separate from material culture and non-material culture. It's just another way to organize it. A mentefact is essentially how we view ourselves in our culture. What does it mean to be part of our culture? If someone were to ask you, what does it mean to be American? What are the words that come to mind? There are probably certain ideas or concepts that come to mind. And generally those are things like democracy, freedom, independence, individualism, mobility. There's a broad terms that come to mind that are associated with being American. And every culture has these mentefacts, and in some cases they can be ideas that are considered good or ideas that are considered bad. Subjective, of course, but that's what a mentefact is. How do we view ourselves? It's almost like a broad collective identity, a cultural identity. How do we see ourselves? How do we fit in to the world? How are we different from other cultures? That's the mentefact. The sociofact is probably the more understandable of these three terms, the simplest of these three terms, because it is such a part of our everyday life. A sociofact is essentially social norms or social etiquette. What is considered socially acceptable in that particular culture? So from the moment we get up in the morning to the moment we go to bed, we are constantly working within sociofacts. We may be unconscious to them because they're part of our culture. They've been ingrained since birth. Sometimes it's hard to objectively analyze your own culture. But if we step back and think about it, we'll see that everything we do is part of a social norm. I mentioned from the time you get up. When you decide what you're going to eat for breakfast, what is a typical American breakfast food? If you were going to go to IHOP and look at the breakfast menu, you'll probably see things like waffles or pancakes or bacon and eggs. You probably won't see a plate of spaghetti. Well, why? Who decided what was an acceptable breakfast food? Well, culture decided. At some point in time, a group of people got together and decided these were acceptable breakfast foods for whatever reason. Maybe it was because of the nutrients or calorie count or carbs or protein, whatever, but it was decided that these were appropriate breakfast foods. And that's why if you have breakfast for dinner, for example, which I'm sure all of you have done at one point in time, it seems kind of cool. Why? Because you're going outside the social norm. That's not what you would typically do, so it seems special. When you go to class, can you wear whatever you want? Well, yeah, technically, as long as all the pertinent parts are covered, we can say, yeah, you can wear whatever you want. But would you? Now, would you means that you're following a sociofact. And if someone walked into class in a bikini or a Speedo and just walked in nonchalantly and sat down and started taking notes, you would probably find that a bit odd. And it would be odd because that person's going outside the social norm. Not breaking the law, but almost breaking a unconscious social law. One that's a little crude, but explains my point, is if you're at say you're at a restaurant, and after the meal, you belch. And if you're at a fancy restaurant and you let out a big belch, probably people are going to laugh, or they're going to be embarrassed, or you're going to be embarrassed. And why is that? Because it's a social norm. We've decided that that's considered improper. Whereas in some cultures, if it is a bodily function of any sort, it's a-okay. It's part of being human, and it's not considered embarrassing. In fact, in some cases, such as with the belching, it's considered a compliment if you did that after a meal. So sociofacts vary greatly from culture to culture. Like I said, sometimes it's hard to be aware of them, particularly if we're in it. But it's usually fairly simple to point out the sociofacts in other cultures because they are so different. So whether it is how we greet each other, do we shake hands or do we bow? How we address different people, how we would address our parents or how we would address elders, a dating ritual or a wedding custom, burials, all of those things. Again, every single thing we do is part of a sociofact. So the mentafact has to do more with broad ideas and concepts. The sociofact has to do more with social norms and social etiquette. And then we have artifact. Now, when you think of artifact, you may be thinking of something that's in the ground that an archaeologist digs up. But in this context, an artifact can refer to any object. So in regards to culture, we're looking at it as how do we use things? How do we use stuff? And particularly, this is important when it comes to technology. And there are some cultures that are very open to technology and willing to try new technologies. And there are some cultures that are very resistant to that or even afraid of new technologies. American culture is very open to it. In fact, very reliant on it. You could not be taking this course, for instance, if it weren't for technology. If I asked everyone in this class, who could go a month without their cell phone, I may get a handful of takers, but I won't expect many more than that. We are completely reliant on it. If I requested that you work on one of your class projects without the internet, not only would you say it would be difficult, you might say it's downright impossible. But of course, we know it has not been that long where we had this technology, and people still seem to write papers and do projects, but we become dependent on those particular objects. So artifacts really are how do we utilize things? How do we utilize stuff? How do we utilize new technology? And how is that incorporated in our culture? And like I said, in some cases, cultures might be very resistant to it, very leery of it, even afraid of it, unwilling to change, whereas others might be very open to it and look forward to new technology. So again, these are not separate from material or non-material. They complement material and non-material, but just another way to organize. Again, the mentafact being the mental component, how we view ourselves, where we fit in to the world, notions like freedom and democracy and individualism. Sociofacts being social norms or social etiquette, what is considered appropriate to wear, what is considered an appropriate greeting, and artifacts, how we use things, particularly when it comes to technology. Are we open to it? Are we not open to it? Now, in addition to this, there are various other categories of culture, and we will get to that in part 2 of the culture PowerPoints.